The Catholic Church boasts a storied past that spans over 2 millennia, tracing its origins to the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and his apostles. Throughout the ages, the Church has played a pivotal role in shaping society's moral, cultural, and political landscapes worldwide. Its structure, with the Pope at its helm, operates alongside a complex hierarchy of bishops, priests, and laity. The Church's history is rich with periods of enlightenment and advancement. Still, it has also faced criticism and controversy for its actions and policies, some of which continue to be analyzed and debated. One such area of examination and introspection is the Catholic Church's involvement in slavery. Delving into this aspect of history reveals a lesser-known narrative about how the Church engaged with, and at times, endorsed practices of human enslavement. You're welcome to yet another exciting video content. Today's episode delves into the Catholic Church's roles in slavery. Before proceeding, please spare some time to click the like and subscribe button on the video. When you subscribe to the channel, we will notify you whenever we post captivating video content like this one. To our returning subscribers, we would like to say, welcome back. Now straight to the video. From the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Greece, and Rome to various empires across the world, slavery has been a grim fixture in human history. Ancient societies often took captives in war and enslaved them. In some cultures, debtors could become enslaved people to settle their obligations. These practices were so ingrained in society that few questioned the morality of owning another human being. The roles of enslaved people were diverse, including but not limited to household servants, laborers, and even functionaries in administrative positions. As time unfolded, the institution of slavery evolved, adapting to the economic and social needs of various eras. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the nature of slavery in Europe altered, leading to feudal systems where serfdom became common. However, slavery persisted in many forms across the globe, particularly with the commencement of the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th century, which marked a grim new chapter. Millions of Africans became commodities in a vast trading network that enriched economies but devastated African societies and cultures. In the early years of Christianity, the Church did not explicitly condemn slavery. Instead, it instructed enslaved people to serve their masters faithfully and masters to treat their slaves justly, as outlined in the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament. This approach reflected a certain acceptance of the prevailing social order. Early Christians focused more on spiritual equality rather than changing existing social structures. As the Christian faith spread and the Church gained power, its stance on slavery began to shift. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church sometimes denounced forms of enslavement that involved fellow Christians, leading to decrees that prohibited the enslavement of Christians. However, this opposition did not always extend to non-Christians, and at times, the Church even authorized the enslavement of pagans and heretics. During the age of exploration and colonization, the Catholic Church's position remained complex. Some popes, religious orders, and clergymen advocated for the humane treatment of indigenous peoples. They condemned their outright enslavement, yet others justified the subjugation of non-Christians as a means of conversion and civilization. This duality demonstrates that the Church's history with slavery is not straightforward, but instead marked by contradictions and evolving doctrines. The Bible contains several passages that early Christians and later the Catholic Church would reference to address the institution of slavery. For example, the Old Testament outlines rules for treating Hebrew and non-Hebrew enslaved people. In the New Testament, Paul's epistle to Philemon speaks of a runaway slave, Onesimus, whom Paul sends back to his master with a letter appealing for his humane treatment instead of punishment. Such references led early Christians to believe that the Bible did not outright condemn slavery, but instead offered a framework for its existence within Christian society. The early church fathers, influential theologians in the first centuries of Christianity, offered varying views on slavery. Some, like Augustine of Hippo, acknowledged slavery as a result of sin and a consequence of human disobedience, but did not call for its abolition. Others, like John Chrysostom, criticized the dehumanization of enslaved people without outright condemning the institution. These differing perspectives among the Church's early scholars formed a foundation that enabled several centuries of debate and discourse on the morality of slavery within the Christian context. The role of the Catholic Church during the transatlantic slave trade highlights the complexities and contradictions of its position on slavery. Catholic monarchs, explorers, and missionaries played key roles in the discovery and colonization of the New World, directly tied to the exploitation and enslavement of its indigenous populations and the imported enslaved Africans. Some papal documents, like Pope Nicholas V's bull Dum Diversus in 1452, granted permission to the kings of Spain and Portugal to conquer certain non-Christians and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Meanwhile, other popes, such as Paul III in Sublimis Deus, 1537, opposed the enslavement of indigenous people in the newly discovered lands and affirmed their dignity and rights. Catholic missionaries were often at the forefront of witnessing the brutality of slavery. While some condoned or ignored the inhuman practices to prioritize evangelization, others, like the Jesuits in some regions, were vocal in their opposition, decrying the deplorable conditions and the treatment of enslaved people. Despite these condemnations, much of the church hierarchy and its members benefited from the slave trade economically and used this wealth to advance the church's influence. While there were voices within the church that called for the ending of slavery, the institution itself was slow to adopt a unified and categorical stance against it, leading to conspiracy and inconsistency in its moral leadership on the issue. The Catholic Church's relationship with the transatlantic slave trade is a reflection of the nuanced and often conflicting positions it held over time. It is a history that includes both resistance to the dehumanization inherent in the slave trade and a pragmatic concession to the socio-political structures that enabled it. In the Americas, some Catholic clergy played a role in establishing the Code Noir in French colonies and similar legislations in other European colonial possessions, which sought to define the conditions of slavery but also codified racial discrimination. While these laws did, on paper, grant certain rights to enslaved people and laid down rules for their treatment, they nevertheless institutionalized slavery and failed to challenge its fundamental injustice. Amidst this backdrop, remarkable figures within the Catholic Church stood out for their opposition to slavery. Individuals like Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th-century Dominican friar, became infamous for their passionate defense of the rights of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, challenging the prevailing norms and advocating for an end to all forms of enslavement. These dissenting voices, however, were often in the minority and struggled to effect systemic change within both the Church and broader society. It was not until the late 19th century that the Catholic Church began to express opposition to slavery uniformly. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical In Plurimis, 1888, which celebrated the abolition of slavery in Brazil, marked a clearer denunciation of the institution. By this time, however, the Atlantic slave trade had been outlawed by most nations, although illegal slave trading and the effects of institutionalized racism persisted. Throughout history, the Catholic Church not only permitted the ownership of enslaved people, but also enslaved people directly. Some religious orders, including monasteries and convents, enslaved people who worked their lands and served their communities. Bishops and high-ranking church officials often had people in bondage as part of their household routines. Documents and records from various periods show that the church treated enslaved people as property that they could buy, sell, or give away, much like any secular institution of the time. Evidence shows that the church sanctioned the inheritance of enslaved people by clergy members, or received enslaved people as part of tithes and donations. For instance, well-endowed abbeys and monastic orders had large agricultural estates that relied heavily on slave labor for their productivity and economic viability. The church justified such practices by citing biblical precedent and the belief that converting and baptizing enslaved people would save their souls, balancing the moral scales. The church's direct ownership of enslaved people had significant consequences on the individuals in bondage. While some church leaders advocated for more humane treatment compared to secular enslavers, the fact remains that they denied their freedom. Church-owned enslaved people experienced restrictions on their liberty. They faced punishment and coercion like slaves everywhere. Moreover, the church's moral authority lent credence to the idea of slavery as an accepted social institution, consequently perpetuating and justifying the practice for centuries. As an institution that shaped societal values and morality, the church's involvement in slave ownership set a precedent that validated the broader societal acceptance of slavery. Enslaved individuals had to reconcile their faith with their subjugation by the very institution that provided them spiritual guidance, causing a profound impact on their mental health and spirituality. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in supporting the colonial enterprises that relied extensively on slave labor. The Church's sanctioning of the conquest and the conversion of non-Christian peoples facilitated the expansion of European powers into Africa and the Americas. Through various papal bulls, the Church granted legitimacy to colonial activities, which often entailed the forceful subjugation and enslavement of indigenous populations. The Church's endorsement was integral to the rationale behind the civilizing mission, which colonial powers used to justify their expansionist activities. The alignment with colonial powers enabled shared goals of spreading Christianity while benefiting from the resources and wealth generated by colonialism, often accrued directly from the exploitation of slave labor. Collaboration between the Catholic Church and colonial powers was evident in the way they jointly worked to exploit indigenous populations in newly colonized lands. The Church provided spiritual justification for the domination of these cultures, framing colonization as a divine mandate to spread the Christian faith. Catholic missionaries often served alongside colonial administrators, actively participating in the cultural and religious assimilation of indigenous peoples. The Church's involvement influenced laws and policies governing enslaved populations' rights and treatment, such as the Code Noir in French colonies. By integrating with colonial administrations, the Church facilitated the establishment of social structures that deeply embedded slavery and economic exploitation as foundational components of colonial society. While individual voices within the Church spoke out against the inhumanity of slavery, the broader scope of the institution's activities during the colonization era significantly contributed to the systems of oppression that were established during that time. Despite the Church's complicity in slavery, certain members stood against the institution of human bondage. Some priests and nuns courageously voiced their dissent, risking their positions and reputations. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th-century Spanish Dominican friar, became vocal critics of the atrocities committed against indigenous peoples. His fierce advocacy for the rights of Native Americans marked one of the earliest forms of ecclesiastical opposition to slavery. These dissenters upheld the Christian doctrine of equality before God, admonishing the Church and society to respect the human dignity of all individuals, regardless of race or status. Their outspokenness stirred moral debates, gradually influencing perceptions and policies within the Church. Within the Catholic Church, a minority took concrete action beyond words. dedicating their lives to the welfare of enslaved people. They provided education, secretly facilitated escape routes, and sometimes outrightly defied laws to shelter runaways. Monks and nuns quietly worked within their communities to improve enslaved people's lives, teaching them to read and write, which was often illegal. These acts of quiet rebellion were rays of hope amidst a dark era, showing compassion in a cruel system. Although these efforts did not dismantle the institution of slavery, they demonstrated undeniable courage and offered crucial support to those affected by slavery. As movements against slavery gained momentum in the 18th and 19th centuries, certain church members joined the cause, adding a powerful moral dimension to the abolitionist argument. Some religious individuals used their pulpits to preach against the evils of slavery, while others penned influential works that swayed public opinion. Religious congregations, both in Europe and the Americas, began to assert that the practice of slavery stood in stark contradiction to Christian teachings. These actions helped galvanize support for abolition, uniting believers and non-believers in a common cause for human freedom. The church's influence extended to the political arena, where some clergy played pivotal roles in lobbying for the end of slavery. Catholic bishops and other church authorities sought audience with rulers and politicians, urging them to consider the moral implications of slavery. They framed their arguments within the context of universal human rights, appealing to the conscience of lawmakers. In some instances, the Church's stance provided the necessary moral weight to tip the scales in favor of abolitionist legislation. The Church's engagement in the political process showcased the institution's potential to drive positive social change, echoing the widespread call for an end to slavery. In recent years, the Catholic Church has begun to confront its historical complicity in slavery. Church leaders have apologized publicly, expressing deep regret for past sins and omissions. Pope John Paul II led the way in 1992 when he acknowledged the Church's role in the injustices committed against indigenous peoples and Africans during the Age of Discovery. More recently, in 2001, the Church sought forgiveness for the sins of Christians involved in historical injustices, including slavery, during a Day of Pardon ceremony. By acknowledging these past wrongs, the Church aims to take a crucial step in the long process of healing and to rebuild trust with those communities affected by their historical actions. The Church has actively engaged in various initiatives to promote reconciliation and healing. These efforts include hosting dialogues and meetings with representatives of affected communities, supporting educational programs that teach the entire history of the Church's role in slavery, and encouraging its members to work towards eradicating modern forms of slavery and racism. Moreover, the Vatican has championed social justice issues. It has supported campaigns focusing on improving conditions for the poor and marginalized, which is part of a larger strategy to address social inequities rooted in historical injustices. As global awareness of historical injustices grows, there are increasing calls for reparations. Descendants of enslaved individuals and representatives of affected communities are demanding tangible actions from institutions that played a role in slavery. They call for financial reparations, the return of land, and other forms of economic justice. While the Church has often supported discussions surrounding reparations, they have yet to take extensive action to provide them. The conversation around reparations remains complex and controversial, prompting ongoing debates about responsibility, accountability, and the forms reparations should take. The Catholic Church has faced significant backlash due to its historical involvement with slavery. During the times of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, various members of the Church supported the enslavement of African people and the subjugation of indigenous populations. This complicity tarnished the Church's image as a moral and ethical guide. The revelations of Church members enslaving people, or even justifying the practice using Scripture, had especially detrimental effects on the institution's reputation. Modern-day critics frequently cite this history as an example of the Church's failure to uphold its teachings on human dignity and equality. Acknowledging its role in slavery presents several challenges for the Catholic Church. It must reconcile its past advocacy for the intrinsic worth of all humans with the historical reality that some of its members actively participated in or condoned slavery. The difficulty lies in navigating the complexity of its heritage, balancing pride in the positives of its historical influence against the acknowledgment of severe ethical failings. Moreover, the Church faces the challenge of engaging with survivors and descendants of enslaved people in a way that authentically reflects repentance and a commitment to repairing relationships damaged by historical actions. The Catholic Church has adopted various strategies to address the systemic inequalities that stem from its past involvement in slavery. Church leaders have issued public apologies, recognizing the deep wounds caused by slavery and the Church's silence or participation in this institution. They have also increased support for social justice initiatives, reinforcing the Church's commitment to lifting marginalized and impoverished communities. Through educational programs, the Church aims to raise awareness of its complete history, both positive and negative, teaching about the consequences of slavery and racism. Additionally, the Church has called for dialogue about reparations, opening the door to potential material restitution or other forms of support for affected communities. These strategies embody the Church's attempt to foster healing and drive societal progress, contributing to a world that upholds the dignity and equality of every individual. The Catholic Church's untold roles in slavery are multifaceted, ranging from complicity and perpetuation of the system to acts of resistance and eventual contributions to abolition. Today, with past wrongs recognized, the Church faces the ongoing challenge of taking substantive actions to address the scars of slavery. Through apologies, reconciliation, and the possibility of reparations, the Church continues to navigate the delicate process of atonement, acknowledging that, while it cannot change the past, it can contribute to a more just and equitable future for all. Thanks for sticking with this video till the very end. If you enjoyed this video and wish to see more of such videos, please subscribe to this channel. Also, remember to like and share this video next time. Thanks for watching.